Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when silence is no longer mercy and repetition becomes grace. When a message returns again and again, it is not to frighten us, but to awaken us. There are warnings that come once, others that come twice. But when the same call reaches your heart for the fourth time, it is not coincidence. It is compassion insisting that you listen. This is not about condemnation. This is about invitation. An invitation to wake up, to realign, to recognize that heaven does not waste words. Many of us have felt that quiet nudge we tried to ignore, that inner stirring we explained away, that interruption that arrived at the most inconvenient time. Yet here it is again, stronger, clearer, and impossible to dismiss. God does not repeat himself because he lacks creativity. He repeats himself because he loves too deeply to let you drift unaware. Every warning carries within it a promise, and every correction is wrapped in hope. What feels like urgency is actually mercy accelerating toward you. This fourth warning is not a threat hanging over your future. It is a doorway opening into it. It is a reminder that you were created with purpose, designed for alignment, and called to walk in clarity rather than confusion. When God speaks repeatedly, he is not counting your failures. He is counting on your response. He sees what lies ahead, and he knows what must shift now to prepare you for what is coming next. Some warnings come because time is running out, but others come because time is ripe. This is one of those moments. Heaven is leaning in, not pulling away. Grace is raising its voice, not withdrawing its hand. What you do with this moment matters, because obedience today becomes protection tomorrow, and surrender now becomes freedom later. The question is not whether God has spoken. The question is whether you are ready to answer. Repeated warnings are often misunderstood as signs of punishment, but in truth they are expressions of divine mercy unfolding over time. When a warning comes more than once, it is not because God is impatient or angry, but because he is attentive and compassionate. Mercy does not always arrive softly. Sometimes it raises its voice so it can be heard over fear, distraction, and pride. A repeated warning is heaven's way of saying that you matter too much to be left unaware, too valuable to be abandoned to confusion, and too loved to be corrected only once. Punishment seeks to repay wrongdoing, but mercy seeks to prevent destruction. When God warns repeatedly, he is not counting how many times you have failed. He is creating space for you to succeed. Each warning is an opportunity layered with grace, allowing time for reflection, adjustment, and surrender. Divine mercy understands human resistance and responds with patience rather than withdrawal. Instead of turning away when ignored, God leans in closer, reinforcing the message because the outcome matters. Repeated warnings also reveal that God sees what we cannot. He knows the consequences ahead, the hidden dangers, and the subtle compromises that slowly erode spiritual clarity. What feels repetitive to us is actually precise timing from heaven. Mercy warns before collapse, speaks before loss, and intervenes before damage becomes irreversible. A loving God does not wait for disaster to prove a point. He warns so disaster can be avoided altogether. There is tenderness in repetition. It acknowledges our struggles with fear, habits, and uncertainty. God understands that change is not instant and that obedience often requires courage. Repeated warnings give room for growth without shame. They communicate that failure has not disqualified you and delay has not ended your calling. Mercy stays present even when progress is slow, reminding you again and again that alignment is still possible. Many people confuse mercy with permission, assuming that silence would mean approval. In reality, silence would be abandonment, not grace. The fact that God continues to warn is evidence that he has not given up. He speaks again because relationship still exists. Correction is not rejection. It is proof of connection. A God who warns is a God who remains invested in your future. Repeated warnings also expose the value God places on obedience. Obedience is not about control, but about protection. Mercy understands that certain paths lead to pain, and love refuses to stay quiet when danger approaches. Every warning carries a choice, and every choice carries weight. Mercy gives you clarity before consequence, insight before impact, and truth before regret. When viewed through the lens of mercy, warnings become gifts rather than threats. They are invitations to realign, to return, to recalibrate priorities and direction. Mercy does not rush you, but it does not lie to you either. It tells the truth repeatedly until the truth is heard. God's warnings are consistent because his love is consistent, unwavering, and relentless in pursuit. If God is warning again, it means the door is still open. It means restoration is still available and purpose is still within reach. Mercy speaks because destiny is still possible and heaven is still hopeful. Each warning is a reminder that time has not run out. Grace has not diminished and the story is not over. That mercy continues to call, inviting awareness, humility, and response, waiting patiently for a heart that is ready to listen and move before what could have been avoided becomes what must be endured, before correction turns into consequence, before mercy has to give way to necessity, because love always speaks first. And when it speaks again, it is asking to be trusted, not feared. The fourth warning is not random and it is not excessive. It carries a weight of urgency that is intentional and precise. Urgency in the divine sense is not panic or pressure, but clarity sharpened by timing. When something reaches a fourth moment of warning, it means heaven is signaling that the window for response is narrowing, not to trap you, but to protect you. Timing matters in the spiritual realm, and repeated warnings are markers on a timeline that God alone can see fully. This urgency does not exist because God is running out of patience, but because a decisive moment is approaching. There are seasons when instruction is gentle, seasons when it becomes firm, not because love has changed, but because circumstances have. The fourth warning indicates that conditions have aligned in such a way that delay now carries greater risk than before. It is heaven's way of saying that what once could be postponed now requires attention. Intentional timing reveals that God is deeply involved in the details of life. Nothing about this warning is vague or accidental. It arrives when the heart has been prepared through earlier nudges, lessons, and confirmations. Each prior warning laid groundwork, removed excuses, and clarified truth. By the time the fourth warning comes, confusion is no longer the issue, decision is. The urgency is purposeful, guiding you toward a moment. T, where clarity meets choice. This kind of urgency is an act of kindness. It cuts through complacency and interrupts routine. It shakes what has become comfortable but misaligned. God's timing often confronts the illusion that there is always more time later. The fourth warning challenges that assumption, reminding you that opportunity and obedience are often connected to specific moments, not endless delays. When timing is missed, consequences are not punishment, but the natural result of being out of season. Intentional timing also reflects preparation for what lies ahead. God does not warn urgently without reason. He sees transitions coming that require readiness. Certain blessings demand alignment, and certain responsibilities require maturity. The fourth warning may be less about stopping something and more about preparing you for what is next. Urgency increases when preparation becomes essential. There is also a protective dimension to this timing. Some paths appear harmless at first, but over time they gain momentum. God warns repeatedly because momentum can be difficult to stop once it fully forms. The fourth warning comes before that momentum becomes irreversible. It is mercy accelerating its pace, not because you are beyond hope, but because you are closer to a turning point than you realize. Urgency is not meant to create fear. It is meant to produce focus. Fear paralyzes, but divine urgency mobilizes. It calls you out of indecision and into awareness. It sharpens spiritual sensitivity and demands honesty about what needs to change. When God speaks with urgency, he is not trying to overwhelm you, but to align you. Intentional timing also honors human freedom. God does not force compliance, he signals importance. The repetition leading up to this moment respected your will, but the urgency now reveals the significance of your response. You are not being coerced, you are being informed. Heaven is making it clear that this moment carries weight. The fourth warning stands as a line between drifting and deciding, between postponing and responding. It is a moment where awareness must turn into action, where hearing must become obedience, where understanding must lead to movement. The urgency is real because the moment is real, and the timing is intentional because what comes next depends on what happens now. God's repetition is often misread as frustration, but it is actually the language of love refusing to give up. Anger seeks release. Love seeks restoration. When God repeats a message, it is not because he has lost patience, but because his commitment remains unbroken. Divine anger would end the conversation, but love keeps speaking, returning to the same truth until it is received, not to shame, but to save. Love understands resistance without withdrawing affection. God knows how human hearts wrestle with fear, pride, distraction, and doubt. He knows how easy it is to delay obedience when comfort feels safer than change. Repetition is not evidence of irritation. It is evidence of understanding. Love does not assume rebellion. It assumes struggle. That is why the message comes again, adjusted in tone perhaps, but consistent in direction. Anger demands immediate compliance, but love invites willing response. If God were angry, the warning would come once and consequence would follow. Instead, he speaks again and again because love values transformation over punishment. God is not trying to overpower the will. He is trying to persuade the heart. Repetition allows truth to sink deeper, breaking through layers of denial and self-justification that protect unhealthy patterns. Love also repeats because it sees potential, not just behavior. God does not define people by their resistance, but by their capacity to respond. Every repeated message is a vote of confidence that change is still possible. Love believes that the heart can soften, that perspective can shift, that surrender can still happen. If anger were the motive, silence would replace warning, but love keeps the channel open. Divine repetition also reflects relational closeness. God does not repeatedly warn what he has abandoned. He speaks again because relationship still exists. The warnings come from proximity, not distance. Love speaks because it is invested, because it is present, because it refuses to disengage even when ignored. Repetition is not nagging, it is nearness expressing concern. Anger escalates to punishment, but love escalates to clarity. Each repetition often removes another layer of ambiguity. What was once subtle becomes direct, not to intimidate, but to ensure understanding. Love wants to be clear so that choice can be honest. God repeats himself not because he enjoys correction, but because clarity protects the relationship from misunderstanding. Love also repeats because it honors the weight of free will. God does not override human choice. He illuminates it. Repetition ensures that when a decision is made, it is informed, not accidental. Love wants no confusion about what is being asked or what is at stake. By repeating the message, God removes excuses and replaces them with understanding. There is also patience woven into repetition. Love waits without withdrawing. It understands that growth is a process and that surrender often unfolds in stages. God does not rush the heart, but he does not lie to it either. Repetition balances patience with truth, allowing space for reflection while still maintaining direction. When love repeats, it is not trying to dominate, it is trying to protect. It sees consequences forming long before they arrive. Love warns because it refuses to watch harm unfold silent. Fly. Anger reacts to offense, but love responds to danger. God repeats himself because he sees the cost of ignoring the message. and cares too much to stay quiet. If repetition were driven by anger, it would carry condemnation, but when driven by love, it carries hope. Each repeated warning still contains an invitation, a path forward, and the possibility of change. Love speaks again because it believes the story is still being written, that obedience can still rewrite outcomes, that mercy can still intervene, and that the heart can still choose alignment over resistance, humility over delay, trust over fear, because love always speaks in pursuit, never in retreat. Spiritual nudges are often gentle, easily dismissed, and quietly persistent. They rarely demand attention all at once. Instead, they whisper through conscience, circumstance, and conviction. Ignoring them does not usually produce immediate collapse, which is why it feels safe to delay response. Yet alignment is not lost in a single moment, but through a series of small dismissals that slowly shift direction without being noticed. What begins as postponement eventually becomes distance. Every spiritual nudge carries direction. It is not merely a suggestion, but a course correction designed to keep the heart oriented toward truth. When these nudges are ignored, the issue is not that God stops speaking, but that sensitivity begins to dull. Alignment requires attentiveness, and repeated disregard trains the heart to normalize misalignment. Over time, what once felt uneasy begins to feel acceptable, and what once demanded attention becomes background noise. Ignoring spiritual nudges does not mean rejecting God outright. More often, it means choosing comfort over obedience. The human heart naturally avoids disruption, especially when change requires humility or sacrifice. Small compromises feel harmless, but the why accumulate. Each ignored nudge slightly alters perspective, making it easier to justify the next delay. Misalignment rarely announces itself. It develops quietly through rationalization. Spiritual alignment is not maintained by intention alone, but by response. Many people desire closeness with God while resisting the instructions that produce it. Ignored nudges create a gap between belief and behavior. The heart may still agree with truth, but the life no longer reflects it. This internal disconnect breeds confusion, making it harder to discern God's voice clearly over time. Loss of alignment affects more than direction, it affects discernment. When nudges are ignored, clarity begins to fade. Decisions become reactive rather than guided. Without alignment, even good choices can be made for the wrong reasons. The heart becomes skilled at explaining away conviction while maintaining outward appearance. This disconnect erodes integrity, not through rebellion, but through neglect. Ignoring nudges also affects timing. God's instructions are often connected to seasons. What is ignored now may not be available later in the same way. Alignment keeps a person in step with divine timing, while delay creates friction. Opportunities are missed not because God withholds them, but because readiness was postponed. Misalignment shifts the rhythm of life out of sync with purpose. There is also an emotional cost to ignored nudges. Inner unrest increases even when circumstances seem stable. Peace is replaced by restlessness, not because something is visibly wrong, but because something is inwardly unresolved. The heart knows when it has bypassed truth. That unresolved tension becomes a quiet weight, making spiritual life feel strained rather than fluid. God's nudges are expressions of care, not control. Ignoring them communicates a lack of trust, even if unintentionally. Trust is built through obedience, and without obedience, intimacy weakens. Alignment is relational before it is directional. When nudges are dismissed, the relationship becomes less responsive, not because God withdraws, but because attention has shifted elsewhere. Misalignment does not always lead to immediate failure, which makes it deceptive. Life can continue. Responsibilities can be met, and appearances can remain intact. Yet beneath the surface, drift is occurring. Direction changes before destination does. The longer nudges are ignored, the harder it becomes to recognize how far alignment has shifted. Spiritual nudges are meant to preserve clarity, protect purpose, and maintain intimacy. Ignoring them leads to gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. Alignment is sustained through small acts of obedience, and when those acts are delayed, direction begins to blur. Sensitivity weakens, peace diminishes, and the heart slowly adjusts to a version of life that feels manageable, but no longer fully aligned with the voice that once guided it clearly. Every warning carries more than correction. It carries an invitation to transformation. Warnings are often perceived as barriers meant to stop behavior, but in the divine sense, they are bridges meant to lead somewhere new. God does not warn simply to restrain actions. He warns to redirect identity, purpose, and direction. Within every alert is an opportunity to become someone more aligned, more aware, and more responsive than before. Transformation begins with awareness, and warnings provide that clarity. They shine light on areas that have gone unnoticed or unaddressed. Without awareness, change is impossible, but awareness alone is not the goal. The invitation embedded in a warning calls the heart beyond recognition into response. It asks for more than acknowledgement. It calls for movement. Transformation requires the courage to step out of what is familiar into what is necessary. Divine warnings are not meant to leave a person stuck in guilt or fear. They are forward-facing, not backward-looking. God does not warn to rehearse past failures, but to reshape future outcomes. Each warning reveals what must shift in order to grow. Transformation is not about fixing what is broken alone. It is about aligning with what is possible. Warnings expose limitations so that freedom can be pursued intentionally. An invitation to transformation always involves choice. God does not force change, He invites it. The warning clarifies the stakes, but the response determines the outcome. Transformation cannot occur without surrender, and surrender cannot happen without trust. Warnings test where trust truly lies, whether in comfort, habit, or in God's direction. The invitation asks the heart to release control and embrace refinement. Transformation is often uncomfortable because it challenges identity. Warnings confront not only actions, but assumptions, attitudes, and attachments. They question what has been normalized and call for reevaluation. This process can feel disruptive, but disruption is often the doorway to renewal. What feels like loss is frequently the removal of what no longer serves growth. The invitation within the warning is to let go in order to receive. Every warning also carries hope. God does not invite transformation without providing grace to sustain it. The same voice that warns also empowers. Transformation is not achieved through willpower alone, but through partnership with divine strength. Warnings reveal areas of weakness not to shame them, but to position them for support. Where God calls for change, He also offers help. Transformation is progressive, not instantaneous. Warnings may highlight the destination, but the journey unfolds step by step. The invitation is not to become perfect immediately, but to begin moving intentionally. Each response to a warning deepens alignment and builds momentum. Small acts of obedience accumulate into lasting change. Transformation grows through consistency, not intensity alone. Ignoring the invitation within a warning stalls growth. Life may continue, but development pauses. Comfort replaces calling, and familiarity substitutes for fulfillment. The warning exists because stagnation has been detected. God invites transformation because remaining the same will eventually cost more than changing. The invitation is an act of foresight, protecting the future by addressing the present. Transformation also restores clarity. As alignment increases, confusion decreases. Direction becomes sharper, purpose more evident. Warnings initially feel restrictive, but transformation expands capacity. What once felt limiting becomes liberating as new understanding takes root. The invitation is not to shrink life, but to refine it. At its core, every warning is an expression of belief in what a person can become. God warns because He sees potential beyond current patterns. The invitation to transformation is a declaration that growth is still possible, that change is still within reach, and that the story is still unfolding, calling the heart to rise above resistance, step into alignment, and embrace the process of becoming what was always intended, allowing the warning to serve not as a stopping point, but as the beginning of renewal, redirection, and deeper purpose unfolding through willing response. Obedience in the present is often underestimated because its rewards are not always immediate, yet it carries a protective power that reaches into the future. What feels like a simple decision today can become a shield tomorrow. God's instructions are rarely about restriction. They're about foresight. Obedience, Ali. GNS a person with what God sees ahead, not just with what is visible now. Protection is built long before danger is recognized, and obedience is one of the ways that protection is established. Present obedience acknowledges that God's perspective is greater than human understanding. Many instructions seem unnecessary because the threat has not yet appeared. Yet God does not wait for harm to become obvious before he speaks. He warns early because prevention is an expression of love. Obedience acts on trust rather than evidence, choosing alignment over explanation. That trust becomes a safeguard when circumstances later unfold. Protection through obedience is not always dramatic. Often it is quiet, subtle, and unnoticed. A decision to walk away, to speak truth, to delay gratification, or to realign priorities may not feel significant in the moment. Yet those choices quietly close doors that would have led to unnecessary pain. Obedience redirects paths before consequences are encountered. What is avoided is often more important than what is gained. Disobedience, on the other hand, does not always produce immediate harm, which makes it deceptive. Life can continue smoothly for a time, reinforcing the illusion that obedience was optional, but consequences often lag behind decisions. When they finally surface, the opportunity for easy correction has passed. Obedience protects by addressing issues early, when change is still simple and outcomes are still flexible. God's warnings are often connected to unseen battles. Spiritual protection cannot always be measured by external comfort. Obedience positions a person under divine covering, even when circumstances remain challenging. Protection does not mean absence of difficulty. It means preservation of purpose. Obedience keeps identity intact when pressure increases. It guards the heart from compromise and the mind from confusion. Obedience in the present also protects relationships. Many relational breakdowns begin with small ignored instructions, subtle warnings about pride, unforgiveness, or dishonesty. Choosing obedience early preserves trust, unity, and clarity. Protection is not only personal, it extends outward, shielding others from the ripple effects of unaddressed issues. Obedience becomes an act of responsibility, not just spirituality. There is also protection in timing. Obedience keeps a person in rhythm with God's seasons. Moving too early or too late can both produce harm. God's instructions are often about when, not just what. Obedience honors timing, preventing premature exposure or delayed action. Protection comes from staying in step rather than rushing ahead or lagging behind. Obedience also strengthens discernment. Each act of obedience sharpens spiritual sensitivity, making future warnings easier to recognize. Protection increases as awareness deepens. The more consistently a person responds, the clearer the guidance becomes. Obedience builds a pattern of responsiveness that guards against deception and distraction. Some protection is invisible until later reflection. Looking back, many realize that obedience spared them from paths that would have cost peace, integrity, or calling. What felt difficult at the time becomes a source of gratitude later. Obedience rewrites potential outcomes quietly, often without acknowledgement, yet with lasting effect. God does not demand obedience for control, but for care. Protection is not about limiting freedom, it is about preserving it. Present obedience keeps doors open that disobedience would eventually close. It maintains access to peace, clarity, and purpose. Obedience today becomes refuge tomorrow, not because life will be free of storms, but because the foundation has been secured before the storm arrives. Anchoring T, he heart, preserving direction, and guarding what matters most long before it is tested. Divine correction is often misunderstood because it challenges comfort, yet its foundation is grace rather than judgment. Correction is not a sign that something has gone wrong beyond repair, but evidence that restoration is still possible. God corrects what he intends to heal, not what he plans to discard. Grace initiates correction because grace refuses to leave a person trapped in patterns that slowly erode purpose, clarity, and freedom. Restoration begins where honesty is allowed. Correction brings truth into places that have been avoided or minimized. Grace does not expose to shame, it exposes to heal. God's correction gently but firmly identifies what must change so that what is broken can be rebuilt. Without correction, restoration becomes impossible because healing cannot occur where truth is resisted. Divine correction addresses roots, not just symptoms. Human effort often focuses on managing behavior, but God looks deeper, correcting motives, beliefs, and inner alignments. Grace understands that lasting restoration requires internal transformation. Correction reaches beneath actions to the heart, not to condemn it, but to realign it. What is addressed at the root no longer needs constant repair at the surface. Correction rooted in grace also preserves dignity. God does not humiliate those he corrects. Even when truth is firm, it is delivered with care. Grace creates an environment where change is possible without fear. Restoration thrives where fear is removed. And grace ensures that correction does not crush identity. God corrects behavior without redefining worth. Restoration is a process, and correction guides that process step by step. God does not overwhelm the heart with everything that must change at once. Grace applies correction in measured ways, allowing growth without collapse. Each adjustment strengthens alignment, building momentum toward wholeness. Correction becomes a pathway rather than a punishment. Grace-filled correction also restores clarity. Confusion often results from unaddressed misalignment. When God corrects, he brings understanding back into focus. Direction becomes clearer, decisions become simpler, and the internal tension caused by compromise begins to ease. Restoration includes peace returning to places where conflict once lived. Divine correction protects identity. Without correction, people often adapt to dysfunction, allowing it to define them. Grace intervenes before identity is reshaped by habits that were never meant to last. God corrects to remind the heart who it truly is. Restoration reclaims identity from distortion and returns it to its original design. Correction also restores relationship. Distance from God is rarely created by a single act, but by unresolved disobedience. Grace uses correction to close that distance. God does not correct from afar, he corrects from closeness. Restoration reconnects what drifted, renewing intimacy rather than enforcing compliance. Correction becomes an invitation back into responsiveness. There is restoration even in the pain of correction. While correction can feel uncomfortable, it is purposeful discomfort. Grace allows pain only when it leads to healing. Like setting a bone, correction may hurt briefly, but prevents long-term damage. Restoration values health over temporary ease. Divine correction restores momentum. Stagnation often results from ignored truth. Grace corrects to get life moving again. Where growth stalled, correction reintroduces direction. Restoration revives progress, not by forcing speed, but by removing obstacles that hindered movement. Correction rooted in grace never communicates rejection. It communicates investment. God corrects because he sees value worth preserving. Restoration flows from that value, reshaping what was damaged without discarding what is good. Grace works patiently, correcting with consistency rather than severity, guiding the heart back into alignment, rebuilding trust, restoring strength, renewing perspective, and reclaiming purpose through truth spoken in love. Creating space for healing to unfold where resistance once lived, allowing restoration to take shape through willingness rather than fear, Every warning places a responsibility on the one who hears it, because awareness always demands a response. A warning is neutral until it is answered. It becomes either a doorway or a barrier, depending on what follows. Breakthrough is not determined by how clearly God speaks, but by how willingly a person responds. The same warning that liberates one heart can harden another, not because the message changes, but because the response does. Response transforms information into action. Many hear truth and agree with it intellectually, yet agreement alone does not produce change. Breakthrough requires movement. A warning reveals what must shift, but response initiates the shift. Without response, clarity becomes frustration and understanding becomes weight. What was meant to guide forward begins to press inward when action is withheld. Delay is also a response, even when it feels passive. Choosing to wait without direction often strengthens the very patterns the warning addressed. Breakthrough does not occur through intention alone, but through obedience expressed in real choices. The heart may feel willing, but until that willingness becomes visible in action, nothing changes. Response activates what awareness only reveals. Warnings often arrive at pivotal moments when outcomes are still flexible. The window for breakthrough is open, but it is not indefinite. God's law. Warnings are timely, and response honors that timing. When response is delayed, opportunities narrow. Breakthrough is not withheld arbitrarily. It is missed when alignment is postponed. The moment passes not because God withdraws, but because readiness was deferred. Response also reveals trust. Acting on a warning requires believing that God's instruction leads somewhere better than the current path. Breakthrough often demands stepping away from what is familiar before the benefits are visible. Response says that trust outweighs comfort. Without that trust, warnings feel restrictive rather than liberating. There is often resistance before breakthrough. The response God looks for is not perfection, but willingness. Even imperfect obedience can open doors when it is genuine. Breakthrough is less about flawless execution and more about honest movement. God honors direction over speed. A small step taken in response can produce more change than prolonged contemplation. Warnings that are ignored do not disappear. They often resurface with greater intensity. What begins as guidance can become pressure when response is withheld. This is not punishment, but escalation designed to reclaim attention. Breakthrough becomes harder when resistance hardens, not because God is less willing, but because the heart is less open. Response keeps the heart flexible. Response also creates momentum. Once the first step is taken, the next becomes clearer. Breakthrough often unfolds progressively rather than instantly. Each response reveals more direction, more clarity, more strength. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable when movement begins. The warning that felt heavy becomes lighter when carried through obedience. The difference between warning and breakthrough is not distance, but decision. Both exist in the same moment, separated only by response. Breakthrough does not always change circumstances immediately, but it changes position. Responding aligns a person with grace, protection, and forward movement, even when external conditions remain challenging. Every warning carries potential energy. Response converts that potential into transformation. Without response, energy stagnates. With response, it flows. God speaks to provoke movement, not merely reflection. Breakthrough is the result of truth acted upon, not just heard. The outcome of a warning is not predetermined. It is shaped by response. What becomes a turning point or a stumbling block depends on willingness to act. Breakthrough waits on response not because God delays, but because transformation requires participation. And participation begins the moment a heart decides to move in alignment with what has been revealed, choosing obedience over delay, trust over hesitation, and action over familiarity, allowing the warning to fulfill its purpose rather than remain a repeated reminder of what could have changed.